Okay, this morning, good morning, and we're going to be starting in Hebrews 11:31. And today we're going to be talking about, I think, a very interesting story, the faith of Rahab. And in Hebrews 11:31 it says, "By faith the prostitute Rahab, because she welcomed the spies, was not killed with those who were disobedient." Now, I really find, for a couple of reasons, I find this inclusion of the story of Rahab just stunning and remarkable. For a couple of reasons. Number one, here we have, all during this chapter 11, we've been talking about for weeks and weeks all these spiritual luminaries of the faith, everybody from Abel to Enoch to Noah and Abraham and Moses and all. And then here we come to a person who you would have to talk about her being obviously a person of questionable character. And just imagine being one of the readers of this passage in the first century, a Jewish Christian, and reading about all of these people like Abraham and Moses and all of them, and all of a sudden get to Rahab, and you're like, Rahab? Seriously? I mean, and it would be one thing if this was a human writing it, maybe this is, not being inspired by the Holy Spirit. It would be one thing to point out maybe what she did right that made her important in God's plan, but just kind of paper over the rest of her life, and not really, accentuate the positive and not so much talk about everything. But no, he's right there. Rahab the harlot. And pointing out that she was a person her occupation was what they say is the oldest occupation in the world. I don't know if that's really true, but that's what you read, the world's oldest occupation. And particularly, not that it's necessarily considered a high-class job even nowadays, but you especially think of in the first century in the Middle East. I mean, as far as these social strata, a prostitute is right down there with tax collectors and lepers at the bottom of the barrel. I mean, that's really how low it was. And to have her mentioned in the so-called Hall of Faith right after Moses, this would be a shock to the readers. I mean, we're so used to hearing it. It's one of those things where, from our perspective, we're just like, okay, now we're going to talk about Rahab, But from their perspective, imagine getting to this verse, reading this letter like, what? So, first of all, her being a prostitute. But second of all, she's not even a Jew. She's a Canaanite. She's from a pagan background. If she was religious at all before this, she was a pagan. So here we have not only a prostitute, but a pagan prostitute. Not that that makes much difference when you're in that particular job, but you know what I mean. I mean, she's not even, they can't even say she was a Jew. I mean, everybody else up to this point, has either been a Jew, or if you talk about the ones before Abraham, certainly the ones who have been recognized to be in the line leading up to Abraham. So they sort of, you can't technically say they were Israelites before Abraham, but Noah and Enoch and all of them were certainly in the line of God's chosen people up until Abraham. So just imagine for a moment, thinking of from a not a religious standpoint, but from a national or customs viewpoint, just think of them putting Vladimir Putin on Mount Rushmore. He's like, he's not an American. What's he doing on Mount Rushmore? Well, this is kind of the spiritual Mount Rushmore for Israel, and you're putting not only a prostitute but a pagan prostitute, a Canaanite here. What is going on? This had to be very much of a shock and even controversial for those first century Jews to read. But I think there's a couple of things that we could say about this. I think, first of all, this is a message that is telling us, as far as God is concerned, your ethnic background is not what's important. Your DNA is not what's important. What matters is the choice you make when you're faced with the choice of following God or not following God, believing in God or rejecting God. That matters more than your national origin. That matters more than your ethnic background. And also, I think another message, very strong message that it sends, is that regardless of what our past failures were in our lives, no matter what our lives were characterized by leading up to that moment of faith, once we make that profession of faith, once we choose God, none of that other stuff matters. Yeah, there may be natural consequences in our lives. Clearly, those things, we continue to have the consequences for the choices we make early in our lives. But as far as God is concerned, as far as our spiritual life, as far as our spiritual destiny, whatever mistakes we made leading up to the cross, that's done. I mean, I'm reminded, of course, of the thief on the cross. You know, his whole life was characterized by wickedness and law-breaking and sin, and he had nothing to bring. But yet, at the very end, and by his own admission, he was getting what he deserved. But then, right at the end, he placed that simple faith, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom, and that was enough. And all of that past was wiped away by the shed blood of Christ. So yeah, Rahab was a prostitute up to this point, but she made a decision of faith, and that was what was important to God. And it didn't matter that she was a Canaanite. It didn't matter that she was a pagan. It didn't matter that she was a prostitute. When it came to it, she chose for God, and now she is celebrated as a person of faith right along with Moses and Abraham and Noah. That means, as far as God, we are all on equal footing. I mean, you could say, okay, she was a prostitute. Well, is that any worse than Abraham telling lies? Is that any worse than Moses getting frustrated with God, bashing a rock because he can't get it to do what he wants it to do and being impatient with God? Is that any worse than God? I mean, we're all equal before God. And once we place our faith in God, that's all that matters. And I think it's a message for, and again, thinking about the context of this letter being written to Jews, and they're wanting to go back to the law, and here he is bringing up someone who was not even under the law as an example of faith. Someone who was not even an Israelite as an example of faith for them to emulate. And to point out that it doesn't matter whether you were a Jew or not. What matters is what you do, in her case, with God, in our case, with Christ. And so that's a very important message that he sent to them by including her. Not only in the list, but I mean, this is kind of like the climax of the list. This is the last one that he mentions, other than just the list of, and all these other people I don't have time to talk about. But I mean, as the one he really focuses on, this is like the end of the list. And I just think that's really remarkable. And it had to be, again, thinking culturally how they would respond to this, not knowing it was coming, getting to this sentence, and it had to be a shock to his readers. Say, oh, really? But again, the bigger point is, what matters is faith. It doesn't matter what baggage you bring beforehand. And it doesn't matter what your DNA is. It doesn't matter what your national origin is. None of those things matter. All that matters is when you come to that decision point in your life, am I going to believe God or not? If you believe God, then by faith, you are part of this family. And I just think that's a triumphant and encouraging and positive message for all of us. So now, obviously, as I have been doing, I want to go back into the passage in Joshua, because he says that by faith she welcomed the spies, and that's true. But I want to go more into detail about exactly, because if we go into the book of Joshua, we're going to see where she actually makes what I would consider it's recorded what her actual profession of faith is, and we're going to see that. But one other thing that I wanted to mention, I did want to point one thing out. The word welcomed here that's in the NIV is actually two words in the Hebrew, in the Greek, I mean. And it means that it means to receive someone with peace. And when you say receive, that's like invite them into your home, to accept them. And the word peace there, we've talked about it before, it's the Greek word eirene. And it means peace, but it's peace in the sense of reconciliation. Like the idea behind it is kind of like a peace treaty, where you have like two enemies who lay down their arms and join together in friendship and unity instead of fighting each other. It's the idea of being at peace, taking two opposing parties and setting them at one in unity. And so that's the idea here, is that in the beginning of the story of Rahab, obviously God's people and the people living in Jericho, of which Rahab was one, were enemies. And she was subject to being destroyed by God's people when they came into Jericho. But what she did, welcoming the spies, that is, receiving them, accepting them into her home, she made peace with them, she made peace with God's people, she made peace with God. So how did that happen? The details of that is what we will see in Joshua 2 and later passages. And the result of it is her reward, if you will, and we'll talk more about that in detail later, but she was not killed with those who were disobedient. So God rewarded her faith by saving her life and the life of her family. But it goes farther than that. It's what we'll see in Joshua. She actually becomes adopted into the family of God. And I think that's what's amazing. He doesn't actually mention it here, but it is in the story of Joshua. So, as we go back into Joshua chapter 2, and I remember last week we talked about the whole, the destruction of the walls of Jericho and all. And the story of Rahab was in the middle of all that. And remember I said, I'm going to skip over all this Rahab stuff because we're going to come back to her next week. So everything that we were talking about last week was happening simultaneously to what we're talking about today. It's like a little subplot going on underneath what we talked about last week. So we're going to begin in Joshua chapter 2 in verse 1 with the introduction of the spies who eventually meet Rahab. Then Joshua, son of Nun, secretly sent 2 spies from Shittim. Go and look over the land, he said, especially Jericho. So I just think that it's interesting. Joshua knows something about being a spy, doesn't he? Because as you remember, Joshua was one of the ones who Moses appointed as a spy to go, in Numbers chapter 14, to go into the land and spy out the land. And he, along with Caleb, were 2 of the spies that came back and said, yes, it's a beautiful land and we can take it, when all the other spies said, no, we can't, because it's beautiful, but there's too many walled cities, too many people, giants in the land, all that, we can't take them. And that was the reason that of all the adults at that particular generation, only Joshua and Caleb were allowed to enter into the land, because they were the only ones that believed God, that he was going to give them the land. So now they're there, and the first thing that Joshua does is send out some more spies. It's like he knows the business of spying, doesn't he? So it says that in the last part of verse 1, so they went and entered the house of a prostitute named Rahab and stayed there. Now, we're not really told specifically why, how that they hooked up. At this point, we know later that even though we talk about the walls of the city of Jericho, the gates to the city were basically open during the day because they had to have commerce and people could come and go. They probably had farmlands they had to go out and tend and that sort of thing. So the spies basically just came into the city during the day. So we're not exactly told how they met up with Rahab, whether she recognized them as not being from the city, she recognized them as being perhaps Israelite spies, and she invited them in to basically hide them. We're not really told, but somehow they end up in her house. However, even though they were supposed to be spies, their presence there, we know, was discovered. Because it says in verse 2, the king of Jericho was told, look, some of the Israelites have come here tonight to spy out the land. So somebody noticed them being there, that they were spies from Israel, and the Israelite spies. And so they told the king, and the king, in verse 3, the king of Jericho sent this message to Rahab. So apparently, not only was it reported that the spies were there, but where they were hiding. Somebody saw it. Somebody saw them going into Rahab's house. And they reported that to the king. So he sent a message directly to Rahab. Bring out the men who came to you and entered your house, because they have come to spy out the whole land. So somebody betrayed Rahab to the king. And so now she's been sent this order to give them up. And there's sort of this, it's not said in so many words, but you kind of know that if she doesn't, her life's going to be in danger. I mean, obviously, if you don't obey the order of the king, you're probably going to be the one that gets killed. So she basically has to give them up, or she's putting her life on the line.
Would that be considered treason?
Of course it would be. It would be considered treason, yes. And defiance of the king's order. Off with her head.
And because it's with an enemy, it might actually even go as far as to like high treason.
Yes, exactly. But she basically put her life on the line for them, because it says in verse 6 that she had taken the two men and she had hidden them. She had taken them up to the roof and hid them under the stalks of flax she had laid out on the roof. So even though she was under the king's order, instead of giving the spies over and condemning them to certain death, because obviously if she had turned the spies over, they would have been executed, she put her own life at stake and she hid them up on her own roof. So she took this great risk to protect them. And so here in verses, starting in verse 8, verses 8 and 9, this is right here where I think is recorded where she has actually placed her faith in God. This is her profession of faith. And we have to remember something, and I've mentioned this to you guys before, that I believe that God's expectation of us in terms of our faith is based on the amount of revelation we have available to us at that time. Rahab at this point, she couldn't possibly know theology. She didn't know the Ten Commandments. She didn't know the Levitical law. She only knew a few things. And she's about to tell us what she knows. And she's going to confess, this is what I know. And then, this is the decision that I make based on what God has revealed to me up to this point. So in verse 8 it says, before the spies lay down for the night, she went up on the roof and she said to them, I know that the Lord has given this land to you. So what she's saying is that she has seen things that have led her to this conclusion that she knows something has changed her and led her to take this great risk, that she knows that God has given this land to them. It says we have heard how the Lord dried up the water of the Red Sea for you when you came out of Egypt, in verse 10. So, even though this happened 40 years ago, this story of what happened when they escaped the Egyptians by going through the Red Sea has made its way to Jericho, and they have heard about this, and she has seen the power of God, or she has heard that the power of God has protected the Israelites since they came out of Egypt, given them great victories when you did to Sihon and Og, whom you completely destroyed in verse 10b. So, and that's pretty relevant to her current situation because they all know that the Israelites are camped out there. and that Jericho is the next city in line. And so basically what she has said is that she has heard and she knows that God is protecting them, that God is guiding them, that God is giving them all of these victories. And then here in verse 11, this is it right here. This is really where for her, spiritually, it happened. When we heard of it, our hearts melted, talking about the citizens in Jericho. Our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. And here it is, for the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So what she's saying is that she is recognizing that their God is the God. Their God is her God. She has basically said, your God is also my God, by saying he's the God of all heaven and all earth. Now, it's clear from the context here, we heard of it, our hearts melted and everyone's courage failed because of you. And so, it is clear that her faith and her turning to God here is based in fear. Because she is afraid that she and her family are going to be destroyed when the Israelites come in. So this brings up the whole question about becoming a believer out of fear versus becoming a believer, say, out of love. And I only point this out because I know that you've probably heard me talk about this before also. In a perfect world, I wish that we could always say that people who get saved become a believer because they're responding to the love and the grace of mercy, the mercy of Christ. As opposed to being saved out of fear or terror. I know you could probably all say the same thing, but I've known people who got saved out of fear because they responded to a hellfire and brimstone kind of sermon. One of those, you might die and be in hell before you walk out of this room.
Yeah, my dad.
There are people who have responded and made professions of faith basically out of terror. And when people get saved out of fear, it's also been my observation, and there's nothing scientific about this, it's just anecdotal in my observation, that people that get saved out of fear, they struggle with that fear and doubts after that for many years, maybe the rest of their life. And there's sort of a corollary. It's kind of the same in a way, but it's not. There's also people who get saved out of an extreme sense of guilt. Maybe something really horrible that they did in their life or that they perceived was really horrible, or just a life that was just a failure from start to finish. And then they, out of this sense of guilt, they turn to God. And then after that, they still struggle with guilt because after we get saved, we're still sinners. We still make mistakes. Sometimes we fall back on the same things that we struggled with before we were saved. And then that's when the devil comes in and says, well, see, you're not really saved because you're still making the same mistakes. Or when some challenging thing happens in your life, when something bad happens, then suddenly you think, oh, God's punishing me. And so people struggle with fears and with doubts their whole life when they are saved out of fear or guilt or some combination of both, because there's overlap there. And so I wish that people didn't have to get to that point to turn to Christ. But the reality of it is that sometimes people do get saved out of fear. I don't have to tell you this because you know, but that was basically Deborah's testimony. She made a profession of faith because of sermons that she heard that were telling her she was going to burn in hell if she didn't get saved, and she was terrified, she was mortified, and so she made a profession of faith. And for decades she struggled with doubts and fears, and did I believe enough? Did I do enough to get saved? And
Was I
did I
sincere
believe hard
enough?
enough?
Yeah.
Huh?
Was I sincere
Was
enough?
I sincere enough? And every time something bad would happen, she would assume that God was punishing her because she wasn't faithful enough or whatever. And it hamstrung her spiritual growth for decades, until God finally did a work of grace in her when she had her cancer scare in 1998 that practically overnight changed her. God gave her the gift of assurance. And from that moment to the end of her life, she never doubted again. And quite frankly, she was one of the most strongest spiritually of any person I knew during that time. I think her faith was stronger than mine at times. It's like God completely turned her around, and she became, if you didn't, I know you met her around that time, so I don't know if you really aware of the way she was spiritually before that happened, but she really struggled in her faith. And it was because she got saved out of fear. But she was really saved. It was legitimate. Now, I do believe that sometimes people who respond emotionally at times like that, sometimes it's not sincere, and that after the emotional pressure is passed, sometimes they turn away, and you kind of get the sense that maybe it wasn't really a salvation experience. They were just responding emotionally to the moment. But in Deborah's case, it was sincere, it was genuine. But she struggled with fear all of her life, most of her life, because she was saved out of a sense of fear. So that was a little sub-sermon that didn't really have anything to do with the text. But other than the question comes up, Rahab turned to God because she was afraid. It's in the same sentence. We heard of it, our hearts melted, and everybody's courage failed. For the Lord your God is God in heaven above and on the earth below. So was her faith genuine just because she was afraid? Yes, it was. Now we can say, oh, it would have been nice if she could have just simply believed God because out of love or whatever, some other circumstance. But that wasn't the circumstance that she faced God. She faced God out of fear because of the fear, and it's even, when we see what happens later and sort of the deal she makes with the spies, that fear was definitely her motivator. But it didn't change the fact that she did believe that He was the God of heaven and earth. He was her God. She had embraced God as her God, even if it was motivated out of fear. So I only point that out as I don't want to discount her belief because it was generated out of fear. It may not be a perfect world it may not be the ideal situation, but it was legitimate. And we know it was legitimate, or else the author of Hebrews wouldn't have mentioned it in Hebrews chapter 11. So she had essentially a plea bargain with the spies. In verse 12, she says, "Now then, please swear to me by the Lord that you will show kindness to my family because I have shown kindness to you. Give me a sure sign that you will spare the lives of my father and mother, my brothers and sisters, and all who belong to them, and that you will save us from death." So again, her plea is based on fear, this certain knowledge that when the Israelites attack, God is going to give them the victory, and she and all of her family will die if she does not do something. So she is showing her faith by placing her life on the line and protecting God's men there, and desires only to be shown kindness in return. And in verse 14, to their credit, the spy says, "Our lives for your lives," the men assure her. And said, "If you don't tell what we are doing, then we will treat you kindly and faithfully when the Lord gives us the land." So they basically make this oath to her. And they say, the men said to her, "The oath you made us swear will not be binding on us unless when we enter the land you have tied this scarlet cord in the window through which you will let us know." And so basically, it's interesting to me that Rahab is asked to show this visible and outward sign of her faith by displaying this scarlet cord in the window. And it's a sign that she hasn't betrayed them, as at this point she still could. And he goes on to say in verse 19, if anyone goes outside your house into the street, his blood will be on his own head. We will not be responsible. So part of the agreement, she has to put that scarlet cord out the window, and all of her family must stay in the house, and that they will be protected. And then in the second part of verse 19, he says, as for anyone who is in the house with you, his blood will be on our head if a hand is laid on him. So they are protected as long as they stay in that house. And so she agrees in verse 21, let it be as you say. And so she is saying yes to God through agreeing with this arrangement. Now I think this is a remarkable arrangement here that I want to comment on. Maybe I'm overinterpreting, and maybe I'm reading something into the symbolism that isn't there. But in my mind and in my heart, this is Rahab's Passover. Because just as the Israelites had to make an outward sign by putting the blood of the sacrifice on those doorposts, so that the angel of God that was destroying the firstborn would pass over her house, likewise Rahab has to hang this scarlet cord as a symbol of her faith and a symbol of her trusting in God. And everyone who is in her house will be passed over by the soldiers. This is her Passover and her family's Passover. And I just think that is remarkable. So she continues to protect the spies. It's interesting. She's actually also pretty smart. Because what she tells the spies is, I'm going to let you out through the window, and you go up and hide in the hills for 3 days. Mm-hmm. But going back, what she told the soldiers who came looking for the spies, yeah, they ran out before you closed to the door of the city, and they went out toward the river. So she was very tactically smart. She said, basically she said they went that way. And she told the spies, once you get out, go up in the hills and hang out for 3 days. They'll come back when they can't find you, then you can go safely back home. So she was pretty smart too. She had it all planned out. So she sent them away, and in verse 21b, she tied the scarlet cord. So as she promised, she would display this outward sign of trust. I trust you. You promised that you would save my family if I did this. So I'm trusting you. So how was she rewarded? Well, the two men, they went back, and they went to Joshua and told him everything that happened in verse 23. Rahab's plan worked, the spies made it back safely, and they told the story of Joshua to Joshua so he would know of Rahab's courage, and he would know of their oath that they made to Rahab. And then they had the same faith that Joshua and Caleb showed back in Moses' day. Because in verse 24, they said to Joshua, the Lord has surely given this whole land into our hands. So just like Joshua had believed that God was going to give the land to them, so these spies did, who are not named, as well. So Joshua said to the men who had spied into the land, go into the prostitute's house and bring her out, and all who belong to her, in accordance with your oath to her, in verse 22. So Joshua honored the oath that the spies had made to her, and when the soldiers went in to take the city, they rescued Rahab and all of her family. And Joshua says in verse 25, but Joshua spared Rahab the prostitute with her family and all who belonged to her, because she hid the men Joshua had sent as spies to Jericho. So Rahab's faith saved her and saved all of her family. God kept his promise to her through Joshua. And then here is the most amazing part in verse 25. The end of verse 25. And she lives among the Israelites to this day. So as a result of her faith, Rahab was basically adopted into the family of God. She was given a home amongst God's people. She lived out her life in peace and safety, and we can assume that she had made peace with God at this point, and that she's in heaven now. And I think it's interesting, we talk about a lot of times how, when we get to heaven, we're going to get to meet Noah and Joshua and David and all, and of course as the gospel song says, but I want to see Jesus. But the interesting thing is, we're also going to meet Rahab the harlot. And the thief on the cross. And other people whose lives were messed up but still believed God.
And it's sad that even though Rahab turned her life around, we still say Rahab the harlot.
I know.
It's
Rahab, formerly known
As the harlot. But I think about this and I think, okay, Rahab believed God and it was counted to her as righteousness.
Yeah.
And again, I think the whole point of all of this was to remind us all that God is not a respecter of persons. And it doesn't matter how messed up your life was before, what sign was on your office door. It doesn't matter what your DNA says. It doesn't matter what, whether you came from this nationality or that nationality. It doesn't matter, none of that matters. All that matters is when you come to that decision point, am I going to believe God or not? Am I going to be a God follower or not? When you say yes to God, that's all that matters. And you don't even have to know all the theology. Like I said, Rahab didn't know the Ten Commandments. She didn't know the book of Leviticus. She didn't know the dietary laws and all the festivals and feasts. She didn't know all of that stuff. All she knew is that God was the God of heaven. And she was going to believe Him. That's all she knew, but that's all she had to know. Now, I'm sure she probably learned a lot more after that. Once she was adopted into the family of God and taught everything, I'm sure she learned a lot because she was clearly smart. But she didn't have to know that to get saved. And the only thing she did was that outward sign of faith, hanging that scarlet cord out of the window. To me, that's just a symbol of the fact that she did not hide her faith. And that she put her life at risk by doing that.
I don't think you're overlooking the symbolism though, because it was a scarlet cord, like the blood
Yes.
of the, like scarlet is red, like blood is red, that they painted on the door. So I don't think you're overanalyzing. I think that makes sense.
It's just when I was reading it, that's what came to mind. That's her Passover.
Yeah.
The soldier, the death, it wasn't an angel, it was soldiers, but death passed over her because she did what God said.
Mm-hmm.
Put that scarlet cord out. Now, God didn't say it, the soldiers, the spies did, but that was God's men. They were God's men. They were speaking to her.
on behalf of God.
And it protected not only her, but her family.
And her whole family.
That was in the house. So
Yeah.
I think that it's a good parallel.
Mm-hmm. And God could have sent her. It was never passed down in the story, but God could have sent her an angel, or an angel disguised as a person to tell
Right.
her, this is what's going to happen.
Right.
You do this or you'll die.
Right.
Or could have sent her a dream, like he sent dreams to several people.
Yeah. He
And
did.
And she never mentioned that, I had this, or maybe she didn't recognize the visitor as an angel, which lots of people didn't. And she heard this and she thought, okay, what do I do with this information? And then, she saw that she needed to hide these men.
Mm-hmm.
So we don't know. I wish we knew more about how she got her information.
I do too, and I'm just going to say that I didn't want to, it's not part of the sermon, because it has nothing to do with the sermon, but I just couldn't help but think, when they first went back to Joshua, we walked into the city and we went right to the prostitute's house. And Joshua was like, wait, what?
Your wording was your wording at the beginning ending was pretty questionable because you were talking about how they sought out the prostitute's house and then they hooked up, and I was like, whoa.
I thought about that too.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that had to be an awkward conversation. I'm like, why did you go to the prostitute's house? Please tell me there's a reason. I wish
You
that
had
we'd been
one
told.
job. You had one job, and it was not to go visit the prostitute.
That's why I kept thinking that somehow she went to them. Like you say, maybe she had a vision. I mean,
Or
and
maybe she just felt, maybe the Holy Spirit
Was just drawing her to
drawing
protect
God was
them.
talking to her heart and
yeah,
saying,
there had to be
Had to be
a reason. I just would have been interesting to hear that part of the conversation that's not recorded.
A fly in the tent.
Where?
Joshua, you left out some details.
But anyway, that had nothing to do with the sermon, but it's just one of those little